Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Rocio Arreguin Campos will defend the academic thesis Surface-Imprinted Polymers for Biomimetic Bacteria Detection from Materials to Food Safety Application. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis?
Dear Prorector, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Dear members of the opponency, dear supervisors, dear family, friends, and colleagues, welcome to this PhD presentation in which I will defend the project that I have been working on during the last 4 years. And that is on the topic of biomimetic bacteria detection. But before going into that, I would like to start by highlighting the importance of the final application, and that is food safety, and that there is a need for the development of cost-effective and fast ways to test food products during the production process for possible bacteria contamination. And that is due to two main reasons. The first one is health reasons. Bacteria is one of the major causes of foodborne disease. According to the World Health Organization, 1 in 10 people falls ill after eating contaminating food. And the second reason is economic reasons, not only related to healthcare, but also due to economic loss that is associated with a product recall from companies and also product avoidance from the consumer. It is therefore very logical that microbiological testing is done in a routinary way in the agro-food sector. Microorganisms such as Escherichia coli, which is a fecal indicator and that some strains can be pathogenic, it's monitored and together with other bacteria using methods that can be either time-consuming or sometimes costly. And that is where the focus of this thesis comes in. And that is the development of microbiological tools for testing bacteria in alternative ways in such a way that we can overcome some of the main drawbacks, and that is that they can be costly or time-consuming. Now, with this in mind, I would like to say that biosensors are one of the most promising technologies for bacteria detection, not only in food safety, but in other applications. I will explain very briefly how they work. Biosensors are composed by 2 elements. The first one is a receptor, which is in charge of identifying and binding a sample, an analyte in a given sample. A receptor is usually a biological element, such as enzymes or antibodies. However, polymers that mimic synthetically the action of biological receptors are great candidates for this application because they possess other advantages, such as being quite stable, physicochemical stable, for example. The second element of the biosensor is the readout platform, and that is in charge of translating the recognition event into a measurable signal. That means just giving a response. The readout can rely on different principles, such as electrochemical principles, gravimetrical, and optical. But recently, thermometric tools have been also proposed to be quite suitable for biosensing. Now, the combination of receptor and readout will give you a result that is on the bench, that means in situ, fast, cost-effective, and applicable. At the beginning of this PhD project, we performed a literature analysis in which we found out that biosensors are quite suitable for the detection of both chemical and biological contaminants in food safety. With this, I would like to move a little bit further on the experimental approach that was undertaken in this thesis. The starting point for this project is a biosensor that was introduced a few years ago. The biosensor employed a surface-imprinted polymer as recognition element. This is the name of the material since it is prepared in such a way that there is cavities, 3-dimensional, that match in chemical functionality and shape to the target, which is Escherichia coli. Once the target is exposed to these layers, then the cavities are able to identify the bacteria binds, and then the biosensor employed a label-free thermal transducer called the heat transfer method, or HTM, in order to enable the quantification of Escherichia coli. That means allowing to know how much bacteria there is in the sample. Now, at that moment, this technology was quite promising. However, there was still room for improvement if the final goal would be to put this application in a specific, this technology in a final application. So that's where my thesis comes in. What could we do in the term of recognition element to improve the performance of the sensor? At that moment, the HTM was already developed in a good point in that now the room of opportunity was in the receptor. Now, then I took the research aim of working with all the aspects that are involved with the polymer preparation, and that is the synthesis and the composition, the imprinting, which means the way that the cavities are prepared on the polymer, and also creating a good functional interface so that there's synergy between the receptor and the transducer, which is the thermal transducer. Finally, the main goal is to detect the analyte, the Escherichia coli, in real samples with two main challenges that are the sensitivity needed and that food is quite complex matrix. So the first experimental approach that was done in this thesis is to take the material that was employed with the thermal sensor and to modify the recipe. This with the hypothesis that changing this small recipe will have an influence in the affinity of the receptor layer towards the template. Now, it was important to modify the polymer and also to imprinting, and that we do it by stamping it with the template, which is Escherichia coli. Then we obtain the cavities on the surface of the material. And it is important not only to assess it visually, that you have the cavities and that they match in shape and size the bacteria, but also it's important to quantify it. So we do it with the HTM. We place a heating element underneath the layer, and then we create a temperature flow. Then the bacteria is exposed again to the receptor layer, and that temperature flow is disturbed. With that, the equipment gives us a signal that we can translate into a curve that enables the quantification of Escherichia coli. That means the response we have is directly proportional to the amount of bacteria in the sample. The main findings for this chapter are that we were able to prepare the layers with a higher surface coverage. That means more cavities in a given area of the polymer. The preparation of the layers was faster due to the chemical modification that was done. And finally, we observed an improved sensitivity of 1 order of magnitude in comparison to the precedent results of the normal polymer used with the HTM. Moreover, we were able also to test the sensor with milk. Then, taking this knowledge into consideration, the next chapter and the next challenging task was to simplify the way the cavities are prepared on the material. Why? Because sometimes the normal imprinting protocols can be laborious. They can be prone to error, since it can vary from person to person. So we aim to change this by developing a new imprinting protocol using a commercial resin. That means we do not longer need to synthesize the material. And then in order to boost the sensitivity, or let's say to achieve lower limits of detection, we added graphene oxide for the first time as thermal additive to the layers. Now, the results were that we were able to create an imprinting protocol relying only on sedimentation of the bacteria. That means we do not need to use a stamp or other artifacts for creating the layers. This technology was patented, and again, we wanted to analyze visually the polymer, the cavities, and the distribution of the polymer, but also we wanted to see if the performance was actually improved by the addition of graphene oxide. And it was the case. So we were able to improve the signal of the thermal transducer when we added the graphene oxide. So the main findings were not only that we were able to overcome some of the main drawbacks or flaws from the traditional imprinting protocol, but also that we were able to patent the protocol, and also that we improved the sensitivity. How much we improved it? Well, it was again 1 full order of magnitude lower than the previous chapter. And finally, we assessed these layers in use, and we matched the results to the European Commission, meeting the regulations for ready-to-eat foods, which is the case for juice. Finally, for the last experimental chapter, what we did is to take the knowledge that we gathered so far and to functionalize screen-printed electrodes. Screen-printed electrodes are standard surfaces used in sensors, let's say for other type of readouts technologies such as electrochemical. And then what we wanted to do is to make the imprints more compatible with future applications and with other types of research that would provide a reproducible interface for the receptors that we developed. So we functionalized the screen-printed electrodes, and then we were able to analyze small sizes of samples in the prototype flow cell that we use in the laboratory. Once again, we assessed thermally how good is the performance of the sensor, and the main findings were that we further simplified the procedure in taking a step in the lab-to-application pathway. We also found out that we were able to keep the sensitivity in a similar order of magnitude than to the other chapters. And we analyzed this material in milk. Finally, I would like to conclude by summarizing that in this thesis, we worked in a general approach to improve diverse aspects of the sensor. This included the materials, the imprinting technology, as well as the final application, which was food safety. However, every research will have some considerations for future work, and I would like to go one by one. First of all, regarding the materials, it has become clear that the material can influence both the sensitivity and the selectivity. However, the selection of the material also needs to be appropriate for the imprinting protocol. And that leads me to the second, which is the imprinting. That if we want to achieve that these layers are used in a specific application, then the imprinting protocol should be suitable for being adapted in large scales. Finally, regarding to application, I would like to mention that in this work, we used colony forming units as a measure of the bacteria. However, for calculating the colony forming units, we use an indirect method for using a spectroscopy. In order to make the sensor much more standard along different laboratories, it is necessary that other calibration protocols are also considered. Furthermore, every application will require a tailoring in sensitivity and selectivity. Maybe for some application it is needed that the limit of detection is lower, and maybe for some others it's not necessary. Finally, in this thesis, I have worked only with liquid samples, and if the application will require the preparation of solids or the monitoring of solids, then the appropriate adaptation will be needed. This PhD project was part of a larger framework involving companies and academic partners. We worked together to generate knowledge that could be applied to a specific application, and that is analyzing or looking for the Escherichia coli in washing liquid of a smoothie vending machine. This was a multidisciplinary collaboration that allowed us to generate a prototype with the imprints that will work inside of the machine in order to detect some of the samples that will be similar to what we analyzed in the thesis. Finally, I would like to take some seconds to acknowledge everyone who's here, my colleagues who, of course, have been behind this work, the public funding that we received for this project, and also family and friends who have, some of them traveled from far away for being here today. Thank you so much for your attention, and I would like to give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you very much for this very clear presentation. That brings us to the discussion round. Before going there, let me introduce the supervisory team to this defense today. Professor Klei, Dr. van Grinsven, and Dr. Dilian, who have been contributing to all the work that was done, but they're not going to ask questions today, so that's why I introduce them now. My name is Ralph Peters. I'm the pro-rector today, so I'm going to guide you through this ceremony. Let me just then start with the opposition. The opposition will be opened by Professor Baumann, who was the chair of the assessment committee and who is also acting today as the secretary to this degree committee. He holds a chair in clinical engineering, and he's also a vascular surgeon and affiliated with Zuiderland Medical Center at Maastricht University. Professor Baumann.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidates, first of all, I'd like to compliment you on the dissertation you presented today. which I read with great pleasure. And it was elegantly written and addressed an important problem, a global problem in food safety. And of course, it goes beyond saying that these compliments are extended to the PhD team, including promoter and co-promoter. And all my words of appreciation go, of course, to the expense of the discussion, so I'd like to commence. Throughout your thesis, you use the Escherichia coli as a model organism. And of course, we know that the E. coli bacteria, a gram-negative rod bacteria, which is anaerobe, normally lives in the intestine of healthy people and healthy animals. And if you look at the numbers of E. coli, there are more than 700 serotypes of E. coli, and the vast majority of these bacteria are completely harmless. And in best case, they cause a mild course of diarrhea. However, if you look at toxin-producing E. coli, those strands are very serious. They can cause serious infections. For instance, if you looked at the E. coli O157H7, that's toxin-producing E. coli, which can cause hemolytic uremic syndrome, which in Europe is the largest cause of acute renal failure in children. And what I was wondering is, should we be concentrating on E. coli as a species, or should we be concentrating on specific strands, or even be concentrating on the toxins they produce?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you so much for your kind words and also for your question. I think what the concern you raise is quite right. I would like to address this question from two perspectives. The first one is that the development of the technology, let's say we need to break down the problem. And so we take the model of organism that will allow us to prepare the receptor and that will allow us to eventually quantify the bacteria, right? But as you say, the problem is broader. The question on how to tackle that, maybe we tackle with only one bacteria, maybe with the whole family, maybe with only the similars. And that is actually, I would relate it to the limitations of the sensor. At the moment, probably you also had the chance of looking, but we also analyzed some other similar strains and also some considerable different bacteria. And the limitation of the sensor is at the moment that it is hard to know how the receptor will be regarding the selectivity. So let's say that in general terms, of course, you want to be as specific as possible if you want to say, okay, we want this specific type of bacteria. But also it can be seen from a broader perspective and say, okay, this is a step of the development of the sensor that will take us to the possible, let's say, stage of being able to identify all of them. However, then the other question you raised, which is, should we also focus on the toxin, is quite valid. And in the group, we are also trying to tackle multiple problems at the same time with some of the colleagues. So one of my colleagues here present is developing sensor for toxins. And that will be, let's say, another route. So the problem, as you mentioned before, it's quite relevant, and there's multiple ways of tackling it. Now, at the moment, with the sensor we have, it is possible to identify some of the bacteria together, because then you will have some cross-reaction with other strains. However, then the question is whether we want to make more specific the polymers so that it can identify only one of them or not. So.
Yes, I can understand that, which is very logical to try and get them as a species or a large group as a whole. Now, when I was going through your thesis, I saw in chapter 3 that by modifying some of the functional monomers used, the preparation of the surface-imprinted polyurethanes, that resulted in a higher sensor performance. And you state that it has a detection limit of approximately 1,000 colony-forming units per milliliter. And in chapter 4, and you presented that just ago, you say we introduced a new and easier imprinting technique using the PDMS, as a resin, and you added graphene oxide in the response you added that, and that caused the thermal platform to enhance its results in a detection range up until, and I just saw you say 100, I saw even 70, I think, which you presented just now. And you state that meets the criteria of the European microbiological regulation. Do you think that's good enough?
Thank you so much for your question. I think that there is never going to be good enough. We have a big challenge in the sense of attaining limits of detection that are relevant. So let's say that it will depend on the specific type of food you are analyzing. It will depend on the specific point in which you are testing the food. So for instance, maybe the limits for being in the, for example, dairy products, for being where the cattle is, maybe the limits are a little bit broader. And then maybe for reaching the consumer, then they are a bit more narrow. So in general, I would say there's never going to be low enough. However, we have had the chance during the development of the project to talk with some industrial partners. And some of them expressed that at the moment, to have a tool that could just enable the identification that, let's say, there is a bacteria in your sample that could be harmful, then that will be enough. But once again, and I think it's part of the conclusion, that every single application will require different limit of detection or sensitivity. And so for that specific chapter, for the use, that's okay, because then it meets the regulatory limits. But there's also zero tolerance for some other bacteria, and then the sensor is not competing against other much more developed microbiological techniques.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Baumann. Then the opposition will be continued by Professor Fujiwara. Professor Fujiwara was a member of the assessment committee, and he holds a chair in parasitology at the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. Professor Fujiwara.
Thanks, dear Prorector, dear candidate. First, I want to congratulate you and the team. It's a beautiful work. I know that it was a lot of work. And for me, it's a pleasant idea to know that someone is working some device, not only for food safety application, but actually in our countries, like poor setting countries, to say, maybe to control the quality, maybe do the quality control of water, for instance. So, based on your thesis, do you think it's possible to combine the bacterial detection as you did with like a pesticide detection or even toxin detection at the same time? And if so, how you would do it? Is multiple polymers or just in the single polymers? I would like to hear something about it.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you so much for your question. Indeed, so food safety, it's only one of the fields that could be addressed for bacteria detection, right? It could be also environmental. In a presentation we gave for this work, there was someone interested in monitoring water from the river of Chicago. And he said, this would be also very interesting for this application. And of course, that's the case. Every application will require some tailoring of the sensor. But indeed, so the idea you present, it's something that we have discussed in the group sometimes. Maybe it is possible to imprint half of the receptor with one microorganism and half of the other with another one. I know there are some research groups trying to do it. It is no very straightforward way. There is no straightforward way to do it, so it's a challenge. However, I think it is very important to highlight that these are very multidisciplinary problems. So there's need to be multiple ways of addressing it, whether it's from the material perspective or whether it's from the transducer. So probably from my side, we can develop the receptor, but then probably someone else needs to jump in also, maybe in the group with the knowledge, and do some modifications to the transducer so that it's able to provide a signal for both of them. At the moment, that's not the case, at least not in our group, but it will be interesting for further collaborations and applications.
No, thanks. And, well, by reading your thesis or dissertation, I have a question about the proposition number 5, actually. I don't know if Baron, if you could read.
Proposition number 5, was that?
Yeah.
When trying to turn a specific aspect of the sensor, it is very likely that there is going to be a trade-off between sensitivity, selectivity, and simplicity of the components of the device in relation to proposition 4.
Thanks. So I'd like to ask you if you really agree with the proposition, because based on your results, you modify a lot and beautifully, I would say. And every time you modify, you increase the sensitivity, but it doesn't seem that you lose the selectivity or other parameters. So I would like to hear you about.
Thank you so much for your question. Indeed, so as Professor Baumann was mentioning before, the thing is that how good is good enough, right? So probably for a specific application, this is good enough. And then we are good to go. Maybe we can move forward with maybe commercialization, which I think is still further. But there's going to be some other applications that maybe will require lower limits of detection. And then for doing so, then you will probably have to compromise the imprinting protocol, for instance. Maybe you need something much more specialized. And at the same time, this proposition makes reference specifically to selectivity. So depending on the polymer, on the different chapters, I use different ones, right? So polymer, polyurea, polyurethane, it's able to give a much more selective response, for instance, than the PDMS. Okay, how significant is that? It will depend, again, on the application. We are obtaining a response from the sensor maybe above 1,000 or 10,000 of other microorganisms. So maybe that is good enough for some occasions, and maybe it is not. So maybe we need to further improve the layer in order to reduce the non-specific interaction with other bacteria. But then that means that maybe the receptor will have to go through a different preparation step. And then probably that will make the process a little bit more laborious. And one of the issues with the layers is that sometimes there's variability in between samples. So you want to also control that. So that's what I'm making reference to. And again, it will depend on the situation.
Oh, perfect. Thanks. Thanks, Diego.
Thank you very much, Professor Fujiwara. Then the opposition will be continued by Professor Hendricks. He was a member of the assessment committee, and he's the scientific director of the Flanders Research Institute for Agriculture, Fisheries, and Food, and he's also visiting professor at Ghent University in Belgium. Please, Professor Hendricks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear Rocio, thank you. Congratulations also for your nice work. It's really multidisciplinary work, so it's also always very nice to see all these kind of disciplines being combined together. And I think also you have made good progress in the biosensor work, so nicely done. Of course, I have a few questions. The first one is about the different E. coli strains you have tested. So, in fact, you have tested your biosensor with the one E. coli strain with which you make your imprints. But then at a certain moment, you test also another E. coli strain, the K12. And of course, we expect of a biosensor that it reacts as good for every E. coli strain you test. But then you find a surprisingly low degree of cross-reactivity with this other strain. Could this be related to the new kind of imprinting process you used when you tested this other E. coli strain? It was interfacial imprinting then that you tested. Also different polymer layer that you tested. Or what are your hypotheses about this reaction?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you so much for your question. This is one of the aspects that I was already hoping for a question, because it is indeed the fact, when we got the results, I made the replicates, the necessary replicates, and we were surprised because of the low cross-reaction with the other strain of Escherichia coli. And we were comparing it with previous work that my supervisors did on a different layer, on a different polymeric layer. And so that was a little bit surprising for us. Of course, we made sure that the results were reliable, and then we assessed that indeed that was the case. So there's multiple things that could be influencing this response. Selectivity is one of the let's say, of the fields, that will be quite interesting to go further and do some extra experiments, because the experiments that were done will not, let's say, address the cause, the root cause. But my guess is that it has to do with the polymer. So there has been already some academic publications on the addition of bacteria on the material I used, of the addition of the bacteria on the material, which is PDMS. Bacteria have some ways of attaching, and this has been studied for example, biomaterials, where you want to reduce addition of the bacteria. And there was this published study in which they exposed PDMS to Escherichia coli and to Staphylococcus aureus, which are two of the bacteria that I tested. They exhibit, let's say, the main conclusion is that the intrinsic properties of the material also has an effect on how the bacteria attaches. And that's only for attachment. That what I'm working here is with imprinting, so not only non-specific interactions, but also the imprinting. So I think there's a big chance that it has to be with the electrostatic forces on the material. So if you take a look also at the results of that chapter, there is, for example, a surprising higher than even for that same strain of Escherichia coli with the Staphylococcus aureus. And then you will think, why does the sensor give me a response that is much more similar to Staphylococcus aureus rather to Escherichia coli or the other strain? So I was doing the research for that paper, and I found out that turns out that, for example, Staphylococcus aureus likes more that material. So I will say the response, my answer will be related to the material, not necessarily to the imprinting, but although other experiments will have to be run in order to answer that. But I think it's the material, that it doesn't like so much the Escherichia coli. So it is giving me a response because I imprinted it, so I forced it a little bit. But it doesn't like it so much. So probably the difference between, let's say, rebinding makes it a little bit bigger between strains. Now, I will say that more experiments will have to be run. And this is quite interesting. When we saw the results, we thought, okay, we could even wait for the reviewers to give us comments and maybe do more experiments, or we could leave it as it is. But I think it's a very interesting topic for future work.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So you mentioned yourself already this cross-reaction with Staphylococcus aureus. In fact, also my second question was about that. You already answered a part of it. But for me, it's still strange that this cross-reaction with Staphylococcus aureus, you see it in fact only with one of the PDMS receptors. You don't see it on the screen-print electrodes, which are also covered with PDMS.
Yes.
Why don't you see it there? Or only at high concentrations of Staphylococcus aureus?
Yeah. Thank you for your question. I think in this case, it's multiple ways of approaching the sensor development, right? So it is actually related to the proposition of when you want to tune something, there's going to be a trade-off. The screen-printed electrodes are covered with flakes of carbon, and that makes it a porous material. So although the polymer is the same, the polymer is covering a surface that is slightly different, so it's rough. That means that then it will change a little bit the way the bacteria finds the cavities. So I will say that it's related to the surface on which it is deposited. However, once again, then we will have to repeat some of the experiments, keeping exactly the same conditions, because there's some difference in between experimental protocols, in between chapters. And I mean, that's a topic for further discussion, but those considerations were made in order to match the final goal of the publication. But I would say it's the surface.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Now, if you look at biosensor research in general, not only your research, but in general, a lot of attention is being given to the sensitivity, and I mean the limit of detection. But do you think that enough attention is also given to the aspects of specificity, but also inclusivity, because you have both aspects which are important for biosensor performance? What is your impression about research which is going on? Is enough attention being given also to these aspects?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Indeed, that's one of the main discussions we have had. If we move further with the project, do we really want to keep on trying to achieve lower limits of detection? yeah, there will be applications that require it, right? If we want the technology to compete with some of the very established microbiological tools, then probably we will have to. However, I agree, in the biosensor field, it's always limit of detection. And I think that's the most straightforward parameter to compare. And I did it myself, right? Like I said, I will achieve for this. However, on the way, I realized that there are also many other important factors, such as selectivity and inclusivity. And indeed, if in my very personal opinion, I think that will make a very interesting field to research at the moment, and there will be, let's say, less competition with other research that is done at the moment that only tries to lower the limit of detection.
Okay, I have time for one question more. Okay, so now you have built an improved E. coli biosensor. It's not, of course, ready for the market, but suppose that you make further steps in future research, and at the moment you have an E. coli biosensor which can be used by food companies. Now, if a food company would use this biosensor and detects E. coli, what do you expect that this food company would do as a reaction?
Thank you for your question. Let me see if I understood it correctly. So if they use my sensor and they try to read for Escherichia coli, and do you mean that they are themselves doing the analysis? Like they are using my sensor?
Yeah, that's the intention.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for your question. Indeed, I would imagine that if they today come to the laboratory and do the measurements themselves, they will require still some quite training, and they will probably not obtain the desired results. I need to be quite honest to the point in what the technology is at the moment. There's still a lot of improvements that need to be done, not only in terms of limit of detection, or let's say the performance itself, but also the format of the sensor. As you said as you saw in one of my slides, there's a prototype of the flow cell that we use in the laboratory. Well, as every person doing a PhD will find themselves doing like this and this so that the experiment can move forward. And so I will say that they will say, oh, wow, how do you make it work? Because it could be a little bit challenging to make sure that the sensor is working. So I think that will be a surprise, the way it needs to be used, although I would say it's simple. But it still needs some training, and the end goal is that it can be used by other people who maybe it's not so trained. And then the second one will be the results, of course. They will require to validate what we are obtaining to what they are obtaining in their own samples. So probably they have already their parameters, they have already the history of samples that they have measured. Maybe they always know what values to expect. So I don't know, I could not sign you right now that they will obtain that result. It's part of the limitations of the sensor. But I think that they will find it a potential convenient alternative to what they do currently, which is sending the samples away and waiting maybe hours or days for the response. So maybe they say, maybe it will give me a kind of a slightly different result that I am expecting, but I will do it here at the company, and maybe if it gives me a positive result, then I can make a decision before letting the product go further into the chain, and then that will be more expensive and more risky.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hendricks. Then the opposition will continue online. We will move to the United States. That will be done by Dr. Sewell, who was a member of the assessment committee. And she's currently senior lecturer at the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Johns Hopkins University. Please, Dr. Sewell.
Thank you. Dear candidate, first, congratulations, felicitaciones for the work. I have a few questions related to your experimental design. So my first question relates to some related questions you have received before, and is the fact that you use a particular E. coli strain, particular ATCC, to imprint your chip. And then as a proof of concept, that same bacteria is used to spike natural samples like milk or juices. Do you think, based on your cross-reactivity results, and also on the fact that sometimes E. coli in natural samples of E. coli grow really differently and present different characteristics than the typical bacteria we buy in ATCC or we use in the lab, do you think the biosensor is ready for detection of natural occurring E. coli?
Esteemed opponent, thank you so much for your question and also for taking the time of joining online the defense. I think that one of the limitations of the sensor would actually play in our favor right now for this question. Because if we are struggling to differentiate different strains, let's say with depending on the concentration, right? It could be that they are this tiny and maybe we cannot even detect it with the right imprinted bacteria. But if the limitation is that at the moment we are thinking about ways of, let's say, making the signal of the imprinted bacteria much more noticeable than the other ones, then I would imagine that if you try to detect other type of strains, other type of bacteria, then it will give you a response. To what extent, I don't know. I would have to, like, maybe to look at the graphs or maybe to make some estimations to quantitative no. Maybe starting from what concentration you will have a response. But I would imagine that it will be harder to do it the opposite way. So to make it really sensitive only for one type of Escherichia coli. So in fact, for that, maybe even less, let's say, modifications for the polymer are needed or for the sensor.
Thank you. I have actually another somewhat related question about that. So I noticed that some of your control for your cross-reactivity experiment included strains like Staphylococcus aureus or Chronobacter sakazaki. It makes sense. There's one of us that gram-negative, one is a gram-positive, and you test for shape and type of cell wall. Have you considered testing bacteria that could be naturally occurring in samples? For example, when you use milk, there is a lot of or a high concentration of certain bacteria that are, for example, lactobacilli, that are gram-positive bacillus, or sometimes in milk production, there's a lot of concerns about growing of Pseudomonas fluorescens that grows in cold temperatures. Do you think you could distinguish based on like the high level presence of other bacteria using your biosensor, bacteria like E. coli that could be present in low concentration?
Thank you so much for your question. So I think this is related to what we discussed before. So let's say the selection of the strains that were used for the cross-reactivity experiments were done depending on different factors, right? But for example, for the last chapter, it's the one that for milk, we analyzed many more, but a few more strains of bacteria. And actually, so we selected it because I think one of the ones is causing mastitis in cows, and we added Staphylococcus because it was the one that we tested before, so that we will have also reference. I think we also included Chronobacter, if I'm not mistaken at the moment. But okay, so based on those results, specifically the last chapter, I will say there's a high chance that I will have some kind of signal when just a random sample containing bacteria is given to the sensor. I would expect so, but of course I cannot guess, I cannot estimate. And one of the further steps for the technology will be actually to validate to some samples that arrive to other laboratories. In the consortium that we participated, there was the real samples of the rinsing liquid of the smoothie bending machine. And the final goal was to compare the results of the biosensor with the results of a microbiological laboratory. In the end, because of time frame, that was not possible. But what I want to mention is that it is one of the main concerns that we had regarding the sensor, and we hoped to achieve that in this thesis. However, then it was not possible. But indeed, it is quite important, quite relevant if we want to compare, and I would expect to have at least some kind of signal.
Thank you so much. I have one short last question. I think you mentioned this at the end when you were talking about limitations of your techniques, but can you elaborate a bit more about the measures or experimental design that you went through to ensure a robust calculation of colony-forming units based on absorbance results, and how that translates into calculation of limit of detection within a confidence interval?
Yes. Thank you so much for your question. So indeed, as you mentioned, in the laboratory, what we do is colony-forming units of bacteria, right? And that we calculate indirectly from OD 600, which is the optical density of the bacteria. But in general, that's just the quantification of a biomass there in the liquid broth. So indeed, what is done in order to calculate this OD value is to make several dilutions of the culture that it's growing. And then you quantify in a plate how much bacteria is there, right? And then you correlate it to the absorption. So indeed, it is indirect. However, and I would actually like to thank you for raising this concern, because when I got some of the comments, I did some research on it. And then I thought, of course, then it makes completely sense to think about a way of matching this value of bacteria directly, so that you are not having an, let's say, in-between step. And especially now that we are discussing about it, like now it's a full chain, right? So you measure the bacteria that you will put in the sensor, and then the sensor gives you a response, and then you want to make sure that that's the right one. So indeed, I will say thank you so much for this suggestion, but one of the interesting points of this future research will be to compare against different calibration protocols for the quantification of bacteria that maybe they are not indirect but direct, such as using fluorescence of the bacteria and comparing to some reference fluorescent material itself or particles. So that will be quite useful in order to let's say, give a much more appropriate limit of detection or sensitivity of the sensor. However, I think this is becoming more and more important as we move forward in the development of the sensor, because then you are going lower and lower, and then you want to go as accurate as possible. So I think that maybe for the beginning of the thesis, where we were dealing maybe with thousands of bacteria, maybe that will be not so significant. But then as you move forward and then you are reaching a relevant microbiological limits, then probably for sure you will want to make sure that that is the case. And if the calibration protocol is one of the ways you can do it, that I think that's quite straightforward. And you made a second question regarding the intervals of confidence, right? Yes. Okay. So what we do is, in the beginning, I didn't include the intervals of confidence in the thesis. In the last version, I have included it. And what I did is that I calculated, using the standard deviation. Sorry, the standard error. So that means the differences in variability among different samples. And then I took into consideration a 90% level. So that means the results that we will obtain will be in that range of 90%, the parameters that I report.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sewell. Then we move back here on site, and the opposition will be continued by Dr. Saya, who was a member of the assessment committee, and he's an assistant professor at the Maastricht Institute for Bio-Based Materials at this university.
Yes, dear candidate, dear Rocio. So I would like to congratulate you as well with the lovely thesis, especially considering that you finished way in the time of 4 years, also becoming a mom, which is a great achievement, I have to say. As a chemist, of course, you expect some chemistry questions. And my first question is related to one of the first chapters on page 22. You have a statement where you say that SIPs are polymeric materials that facilitate the imprinting of macromolecular targets, such as proteins, microorganisms, or whole cells. So can you maybe give a definition of a macromolecule and maybe comment on the sentence?
Yes. Esteemed opponent, thank you so much for your question. Indeed, so the first chapter is a review, right? So I tried to compile what's out about imprinting polymers. And I came out with this distinction between the material in which you have molecules, so that's molecularly imprinted polymers, that's really mainly for molecules, but you can also have some like a slightly larger templates. But then you have surface-imprinted polymers. And that will be mainly for bigger molecules, such as, for example, small pieces of a polymer, or small pieces, or for example, a protein or a cell. So the main distinction, let's say, where the line could be drawn much more clearly, will be microorganisms and molecules. Then how big the molecule is could fall something in between. But this would relate to the type of protocol that you want to use for imprinting. The reason why there's this distinction is because molecules, you can put them in a solution with the polymer that's going to be imprinted, and then you mix it. And then the cavities will be formed randomly inside of the material. Whereas for the surface, you really want to make sure that you prepare the polymer, and then you somehow, whether it's stamping, whether it's sedimenting, you put the target on the top. So let's say that if you have X molecule or X analyte that you want to imprint, then you need to make the appropriate adjustments to the protocol. It might be even that you can imprint some of the larger bacteria, in a molecule, in a molecular imprinted polymer. However, then you will have some problems with the removal of the template. So the line could be drawn with that, with the size and what type of template you have. But you have even bacteria imprints, and they refer it as molecularly imprinted polymers because they were the first material. So let's say that surface imprinted polymers is just a newer field, and some people doesn't refer still to surface.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so actually it was more of a terminology question because I think a microorganism is not a molecule, but it's a bunch of molecules. But I understand the distinction that you have to make in that respect. Then going to chapter 3, you're talking about the the affinity is determined by supermolecular interactions. So what type of supermolecular interactions would you expect with your, let's start with the E. coli. Basically what type of molecules do we have on the cell surface?
Esteemed opponent, thank you so much for your question. So it's mainly membrane components of the bacteria. So there is only a few studies that actually say, okay, it is related to this specific aspect of the membrane, but it has been mentioned that it has to do with the lipopolysaccharides, and also to some of the functional groups that are on there. So for example, phosphate groups and carboxylic groups. So it could be that it's mainly a hydrogen bonding. So it's hydrogen bonding between all the components that are on the surface, on the membrane of the bacteria.
Okay, so hydrogen bonding. So you, in chapter 3, you also made this polyurethane urea, which then has hydrogen bonding. Maybe then as a follow-up question, so how could you hypothetically improve the binding by having different interactions? Can you think of some groups?
Yeah. Thank you so much for your question. Yes, I will think that, I mean, of course, you can always tailor the building blocks, right, so that you have more hydrogen bonding, which is what I did in this case. And you can also do, for example, playing around also with the electrostatic interactions. So not only direct hydrogen bonding, but also some weaker interactions. So for example, very straightforward, what comes to my mind, one of the polymers that I was using, only varying the ratio between a monomer and cross-linker would have an influence. I am just like not guessing, but it has not been done yet for bacteria, whereas for molecules imprints, it has been done. They play around with the monomer ratio, and that improves or, let's say, enhance the binding. So I will say even just the ratio, but you can also have some other specific building blocks. For example, for the PDMS, I have seen that they functionalize it with polyethylene glycol with some chains, so that there's not only let's say, the PDMS itself, but some added functionalities. But I will say it's very interesting for future work. We have even thought about it in the group. How do we make more, let's say, chemistry about the layers, because there's still big potential. So it could be, like that.
Great. Then moving on to your synthesis. yeah, I was a bit disappointed to see that there were no molarity or moles included in the. I only see the mass and the volumes.
Yep.
But so I calculated it myself, and then afterwards I saw that you had the molar ratios at the appendix.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
But my question is actually different. So in this chapter, you've basically used one diamine. And my first question is, why did you only choose one diamine? And did you think about others? And if you did, which ones would you consider and why?
Thank you so much for your question. Indeed, I included one diamine. I wanted to make the system as simple as possible. And as I mentioned, the main aim was to modify the traditional polyurethane recipe. And in that recipe, there's the bisphenol A, which is an aromatic alcohol. And then the diamine that I used resembles a little bit in the structure, let's say in the aromaticity and the number of aromatic rings. So I thought that would be suitable in order to compare, let's say, in an accurate way, so that you don't think like, okay, I'm adding other two monomers and maybe that way boosting the sensitivity, which is what I wanted to test in the final, let's say, the final goal. So that's why I chose that specific diamine.
I would actually like to disagree with you that this diamine is maybe not as similar to bisphenol A, because we're now talking about benzylic amines, and they are not aromatics, because it's not directly connected to the aromatic rings. So knowing this, what type of amine would you rather pick?
Well, thank you for your question. I think it's good to agree to disagree. You are right in the fact that the functionality is not directly attached to the relevant part of the ring. However, it is like, the imprinting protocol had to do also with the way the molecules are like built into the polymer. So in terms of structure, I wanted to resemble a little bit more, but indeed, so you can even use shorter amines. You could use maybe less bulky amides and see how it works with the integration into the polymeric chains. So at the moment, I do not immediately think about an alternative amide, but it could be also the ones that are built with amino acids, right? It could be. I think that the hypothesis of adding an extra functionality, depending on what type of amine you're adding, or regardless of what it is, will give us an improvement. But that's still to be proved. So.
Okay, thank you. Maybe another question related to this part. So later on, you mentioned that this aromatic diamine is more reactive. And I'm curious if that's really the case. So can you elaborate maybe your answer or this comment related to the pKa between aliphatic amines and phenols?
Okay, thank you so much for your question. I think this goes much more specifically, right, on the way the reaction proceeds. I would like to say that it is rather hard for me to answer that question at the moment. I will have to think more about it, and I'm a little bit
I can imagine
spot,
that.
But
so I think that in this case the amine is quite basic. So basically, this means that you would deprotonate the phenol, and then you have different. You have a different reactivity than in the case of bisphenol A. Okay, I want to go. How much time do we still have?
Well, we have 5 minutes.
Okay, so I have plenty of chemistry questions to go with.
That is good news.
Then. Maybe I want to go to the isocyanate that you've used. So I'm then curious to see, why did you pick this isocyanate, and what would happen if you would have, let's say, if you would have eliminated the phenyl ring, what would have happened?
Thank you so much for your question. I went for this option because it's the one that it's traditionally used in the other polyurethane. So as I mentioned, I wanted to make as small modifications as possible, but keeping the, let's say, the hypothesis that I wanted to prove. So I will say that the polyurethane will still be able to be used for the imprinting, because in the end, what gives the functionality of the layer will be the imprinting itself. Yes, the chemistry will be playing a role, but it's also the imprinting. So maybe that's also a good question for wondering, like, what type of other isocyanates. And I will say that any polyurethane will be suitable for the imprinting, at least with this type of imprinting, not with others, but stamping, yes.
Good. And you're comparing it with enzymes, and enzymes are of course very dynamic. So if you then compare your monomers, which are very rigid, can you then maybe include this in what will happen, let's say, if you would introduce an more aliphatic character, let's say? Yeah. What would happen with the SIP?
Yeah. Thank you so much for your question. So I would imagine that there will be more stacking with the rings, so that will make it a little bit more rigid. Indeed, that's a very good point to consider if you want to maybe make it a little bit more closer to the enzymes, right? As you say, they change their disposition to match the target. So I think that's a very good suggestion to take into consideration. However, there's very little literature available on the tuning of the monomers and monomer ratios. So although I think it's very relevant, I think it's still very unknown territory for these layers. I think it's quite interesting to think about it and to think that we are trying to mimic it so in like as close as we can. So that will be also a good option.
Rocio Arreguin Campos, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. And I request that you and your company, the audience here, will await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room. I adjourn.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. All your time, cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. Even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. south side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and not. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and not. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Rocio Arreguin Campos, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Clay is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I do, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Rocio Arreguin Campos, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Rocio, nice to be the first one to give you congratulations. So work very well done. Nice, nice research. Nice new things in there. It's of course always a bit unfair that I do this, because you are again one of the PhDs in the group who have barely seen me. You started after I became dean of the faculty, and I'm still dean of the faculty at this moment. That means that I spend my days in bureaucracy and not in science. I'll let the laudatio done by somebody who really spent a lot of energy with you and time with you, and Bart will take over from here. But congratulations very much.
Thank you so much.
Dear Rocio, now that I'm writing this speech, I have to admit that it is harder as compared to the previous ones. The guys that went before you all did stupid things, and it was extremely easy to make fun of that. You, on the other hand, have always walked the line. I think it is safe to say that you've gone through some changes in the past 4 years. When you started your PhD trajectory, the sensor engineering department was slowly getting shape. For me personally, this was also a difficult time. I started to realize that my research time, together with Casper and Hanne, was coming to an end. The group needed to be managed, proposals needed to be written, and courses needed to be taught. I had to let go of my research, something tangible that together with Casper and Hanne I achieved, and now I had to hand it over. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I'm lucky that I could hand it over to you. A girl who, together with her husband, left Mexico, did a master's degree here, and was dedicated to pursue a PhD degree. A 4-year marathon with bad weather and horrible food. To this day, I admire your dedication. The start was hard. It was hard to generate results, temperatures were not stable, and at one point you were even taping the windows with aluminum foil to stabilize the room temperature. It did the job, but I did feel the urge to tell you that in these parts of the world, this type of installation has a somewhat different connotation. However, it did lead to your first tangible result. After this, it was smooth sailing, result-wise. After a few years of smooth sailing, you came into my office and told me that you wanted to have a talk. Of course, as I always do, I immediately panicked. But after a few minutes, you told me the most beautiful news. You were expecting a baby. It was from this moment on that we both had to go through a very steep learning curve. I was never in the lucky position that one of the PhDs was pregnant. But we also realized that there were some hurdles to overcome. So Debbie scheduled the talk. And during the talk, I had to ask questions that I really did not want to ask, and you had to provide answers that you really didn't want to give. Armed with a list with do's and don'ts from Debbie and Hanne, I went into the talk. I think because we were honest and open to each other, that we got where we needed to be. With the help of Manlio and Margot, you were able to finalize your practical work, and you, being you, you handed in the first draft of your thesis only a few days before beautiful Paula was born. Dear Rocio, you left your family and your country, came to the Netherlands to obtain a master, did a PhD, and while doing that PhD, you became a mother. But now the marathon, which you have sprinted, is over. You did an amazing job. I want to thank you for being the researcher that we needed, that I needed, but moreover, for being the person that you are. I'm happy that you're staying to help build out this SE adventure, and I'm looking forward to seeing you back at the DOP more often. Your calm presence was missed by all. To you, your family and friends, my heartfelt congratulations and respect. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Bart.
Dear Dr. Rocio Arreguin Campos, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I would like to congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. I would like to extend my congratulations to the family and friends, and to the colleagues, to the supervisory team, and everyone present here. I would also like to thank the members of the committee for their participation, especially those who traveled from elsewhere to be here or who joined us online from quite a distance and different time zones. So thank you all very much for being here today. That brings us to the end of this ceremony, so let me close the official part. And there's a few household messages left. Now that the ceremony is closed, we will just move to the celebrations. Yeah, the recording stopped. And after that, we will make some more pictures on the stairs and do the quick congratulations. And you can wait for us, or you